For tonight's program, we have Chris Daley coming back, his final lecture for the fall. Again, just a little brief bio on Chris. He's a resident of Wareham. He's a history teacher in the Silver Lake Regional School System in Kingston. Until recently, he was a member of the Board of Executives and chairman of the Educational Outreach Program at the John Alden Historic Site in Duxbury. He formerly served as the chairman of the Pembroke Historical Commission and the president of the Pembroke Historical Society. He's received both his bachelor's degree and master's degree from Bridgewater State University. He's been lecturing on historical topics throughout New England for 20 years now, and he's in the process of publishing a book that had its genesis in his lecture entitled Mass Murder, which is various murders throughout the centuries in Massachusetts. One of them, let's see here, it's entitled Phyllis and Mark, a case of petite treason. This was back in 1755. We also have, of course, the Boston Strangler, the Lizzie Borden case, a bunch of different things, and this is coming out in a book pretty soon, right, Chris?
Yes.
Okay. So tonight we have Chris. Please come up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again. Show of hands, how many people have a little Irish in them? Oh, why did I think that would happen? Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am 5th generation Irish. And as far as I can tell, I'm 100% Irish. One Irish married another. My mother's maiden name was Mahoney. You go all the way back. But ladies and gentlemen, I come to tell you that I think I broke the mold. My wife, who is usually here with me, is Portuguese, she's French, she's Cherokee, she's German. She's like the United Nations. So I'm the end of the line on the 100% Irish, I guess. And she couldn't be here with me. And that's how I usually get her all embarrassed, and it's kind of weird without her here. So this lecture came out of, obviously, my heritage. For a long time, I wasn't really interested in Irish history, and then I think as you get older, you start to get into your genealogy, and you want to learn. And I got into the genealogy a little bit, and I found that there is quite a saga here in Boston. Originally, this was going to be the Irish in America, but you don't want to be here for the next 3 weeks. So we whittled it down to Irish in Boston, and pretty much it's through the 1600s up until about the time of Mayor Curley. And then it stops because there's a lot of stuff after that. Ratman is one thing that I didn't want to get into either. So without any further ado, let's get going here. I ask you if you have any questions or comments, please hold them to the end, and so we can have a nice smooth lecture. And let's get going. So contrary to popular belief, the Irish were not the first in Boston. It was the Puritans. They came around 1629, 1630, and they came pretty much because of this guy. Now, when you look at Henry VIII, most people will tell you he had 6 wives and he chopped their heads off and everything. But the main reason why the Puritans came here was because Henry VIII removed all of England from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England. Now, if you were to go into an Anglican church, Church of England, you would think you were in a Catholic church. The thing was, there were many people in England that wanted to make it more purified. They wanted to go back to the original Christianity of the 1st century, get rid of all the robes, the statues, and get down to basics. And they didn't like the Church of England, so they wanted to purify it. Now, there's a common mistake that the Pilgrims were Puritans too. They were actually separatists. They didn't want to purify the church, they wanted to separate from it. Now, the Puritans, they moved into England, and here's an Anglican church. This is the type of church they would like to have. This is not a church. This is John Calvin. This is the man that they followed. He inspired them. This is the type of church that they would have. No crosses, no statues. The priests are dressed very drably. And that was their outlook. And they came here to practice their religion the way they wanted it because they were being persecuted in England. So they came here looking for religious freedom. The only thing is, when they got here, they didn't want to give it to anybody else. And as you can see, in 1630, a whole fleet of ships pulled up along the coast. At first, they landed in Charlestown, but they found that there wasn't any potable water over there, and they moved to a little peninsula called Shawmut by the Indians. And they wanted to make this their city on the hill, their New Jerusalem, where they could start all over again and purify what had been going wrong for centuries in their minds. And they started with this little peninsula. This is what Boston looked like when they first came here. In fact, at high tide, it was an island. And this is where they were going to build that city. And this is probably what it looked like initially. What you're looking at is probably the section near the old State House. And you could still see Beacon Hill from that point. And this is where they wanted to create their New Jerusalem. Now, most people, if you ask them, you'll say, when did the Irish first come over to America? And they'll say, oh, well, when the potato famine hit. That's kind of incorrect. Actually, they were over here almost as soon as the first English were over here. But they didn't come over willingly. They came over as indentured servants. Now, when we went to school, if you learned what an indentured servant was, it was basically somebody who agreed to come over. They agreed to serve somebody for a period of 5 to 7 years, and in return, they would get their passage paid over, and they might even learn a trade. This was not true for the Irish, so the indentured servant tag is a little bit of a misnomer. In fact, they were brought over here against their will. And it was mainly due to this man. This is Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector. Now, a little bit of history back in England. They had a civil war too, between the Anglicans and the Puritans. And the Puritans won. The king was executed. How many people knew that? Not a lot of people know this. History major. The king was beheaded by the Puritans in England. They took power, and this man became, for all intents and purposes, the new king, but he didn't take that title. He was the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Initially, he was the leader of the Puritan army, and he took control. Now, after he took control, he started getting word back from Ireland that the Irish were giving the English their troubles. Now, a little bit of history on the English in Ireland. Probably since the time of William the Conqueror, the English had been getting involved in Ireland's business. In fact, it got really ramped up during the age of Elizabeth. And then by the time Cromwell got in, they had almost fully occupied Ireland. Now, some of these Irish were fighting back. This was their land, and they were fighting back. When Cromwell took power, he heard stories of atrocities committed by these Irish on the English. Now, when these got to his ears, he heard that people had been... Is this mic just... How about I get rid of it? How about that? It's bothering me. All right, this is a lot better. Yeah, that mic is not working too well. Now, the thing with the English had been involved in Ireland for many years. And as I said, they were in their business. They had been taking land and everything. Now, by the time Cromwell got in, he had gotten these reports that the Irish had committed atrocities on the English that had invaded their country. And what he was going to do with his new model army, which is what they called it, he was going to teach the Irish a lesson for doing this horrible thing to the English people. It turns out, in hindsight, years later, all these so-called atrocities that he heard of actually weren't really anything bad. They weren't really as bad as they seemed to be. But what he decided to do was take his army into Ireland and teach them a lesson, and that's what they did. He took his army in, and first place they ended up was Drogheda. And it was kind of an old medieval town, had a wall around it. He surrounded the city, and he told the mayor, he said, "Give up now, or we will show no quarter." And that means no mercy. If we have to go through these walls, everyone's going to die. And you know what the mayor said? He's Irish. What's he going to say?
No.
I think what you said earlier today. A little Gaelic saying, I'm not going to repeat it.
Yes.
Yes. But he said that, and Cromwell and his army spent several weeks laying siege to this city. Finally, they got in. Finally, they went after it. They killed all the soldiers, and they killed 4,000 civilians in this city, just to teach the Irish a little lesson here. And then they went on further. They wanted to totally subjugate the island. They went to Wexford and pretty much did the same thing. 1,500 civilians. No, we're not talking soldiers here. Civilians killed, men, women, and children. Also, the siege of Waterford, 400 killed. Ireland was on her knees, and that's exactly what he wanted. He had taught the Irish a lesson. They were totally in control of him and his armies. Now, he didn't stop there. And this is how some of the Irish got here. And I say they got here unwillingly. This is amazing. I came across this fact and I was astounded. Over 100,000 Irish children were plucked from the arms of their parents and sent into indentured servitude in the Caribbean, Virginia, New England. And essentially they were sent as slaves. Eventually they would gain their freedom, but this is what he did. What it was a tactical plan to take out the population of Ireland and reestablish it as an English colony. And how do you do that? You get rid of the Irish. Now that wasn't it. He also sent thousands of men and women as indentured servants to America. And this is how the first Irish came here. Now many of them couldn't even speak English. And when they first got here, this is probably a scene that they would have experienced. Here's the Puritan master with the indentured servants. And you know what the first thing they did was, as soon as they got off that ship? They escaped. This is an actual runaway slave advertisement. And this is something that's very interesting. There are actually two runaways here. One is a Negro fellow, and right below here is an Irish man. Sometimes the Irish would actually band together with some of the black Africans that came over as slaves, but it was easier for them to slip away into the population simply because they looked like everybody else. This is one of the reasons why Africans ended up as slaves, because they were easily identifiable. And this is probably what would have happened to you if you got caught running away as an Irish indentured servant. You might get the pillory or the stocks, or you could be whipped at the cart's tail. This is how the first Irish came here. Now, the first real voluntary migration was the Scots-Irish. And growing up, I always was like, what's the difference between Scots-Irish and Irish? I really didn't know. I thought maybe they drank scotch or something. The thing is, during the Puritan age, what happened was this attempt to colonize Ireland was in part done with Scottish. You had Scottish Presbyterians up here, and the Scottish Presbyterians followed that fellow Calvin that I showed you. They were like the same thing as the Puritans, except they were Scottish. So they were together as religious brothers. And what England tried to do is to get some of these Presbyterian, the Ulster Scots, to settle Northern Ireland here. That's why they're called the Ulster Scots. And they did that. During the Puritan age, they flooded into Northern Ireland. That's why you still have the strife today in Ireland, because the northern part is a majority, I believe, Protestant. And that's because of this colonization attempt. Well, the Puritans only lasted a few years. I think the people of England just simply got tired of the Puritans. They didn't allow theater. They were opposed to drinking. They didn't like things like bear baiting. Do you know what that is? That's when you tie a bear to a post and then you bait it and tease it. People loved it back in the Elizabethan age. They didn't allow all these things. They didn't celebrate Christmas. So I think the people got a little sick of them after a while, and they wanted to bring the king back. The only thing was he was dead. So they did the next best thing and brought his son back. And the parliamentarians or the Puritans were out of power. So that meant that the Scots that had colonized Ireland were a little bit out of power too, and out of favor. Something called the Sacramental Act was passed. And basically what this said was, unless you are an Anglican minister, you cannot hold any kind of services. It has to be Anglican. So now they're discriminating against the Puritans again. These Scots-Irish saw this coming. They knew that they had brethren over in America. These Puritans had already escaped. They thought, if we can't practice here in our new country, Ireland, we're going to go to another new country. We're going to America. And they did that. And they made a connection with this fella. This is Cotton Mather. And they had correspondence. They wrote back and forth, and Cotton Mather, he made Massachusetts sound great. Come on over here, join us. You'll live with us. We'll be brothers. And when they got over here, they found that wasn't quite the story. When they got here, they found that the Puritans had a plan for them. Their plan was to use them as sort of a buffer against the natives. As soon as they got to Boston, most of them were shipped out to the western Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, because they didn't really want them around in Boston. And this next picture will give you an idea of how they thought of these Scots-Irish Presbyterians. This is what the Puritans called the church that the Presbyterians, the few Presbyterians that did stay in Boston, they established a church. And the Puritans called it the Church of the Presbyterian Strangers. Now, they're brothers in religion, but they're still Scots and they're Irish. You know, there's always that animosity going back and forth between not only the Irish and the English, but the Scots and the English as well. And this is where that church was. This is the present-day site of that church. Now, I couldn't fit the whole building in, so I did this. That church eventually became the Congregational Church that is now on Arlington Street, right near Boston Common. And that is the church that today still has that congregation that started off as the Presbyterian Strangers. So this is the first influx of Irish. There were only a few thousand, but this is the first real migration. Now, we start to see some issues going on here. Immediately, even though there are very, very few Irish Catholics in Boston, probably either the descendants or still indentured servants, rumors were going around that there was a Jesuit priest in town. So they passed this law, the anti-Catholic law of 1647. And let me read this to you. This is the actual text. This law stated, "Death to all and every Jesuit, seminary, priest, missionary, or other spiritual or ecclesiastical person made or ordained by any authority, power, jurisdiction, derived, challenged, or pretended from the Pope or See of Rome." Translation, no Catholics allowed. You don't have any priests, you don't have any church, you don't have any Catholics. You wonder what these folks did. These people that were Catholic were ripped out of their country and stuck here. They didn't have any church. They didn't have any way to worship at all. They must have done it underground. You wonder if there was a Jesuit priest sneaking around. I don't think they ever caught him if there was. Now, this is another incident that happened in the 1600s that shows you the tone of the times. This is the story of Goody Glover. She was a indentured servant that had been sent to the West Indies and then brought up here. Her husband had died. She spoke a little bit of English, mostly Gaelic, and she was accused of witchcraft. Now, this is actually a book written by Cotton Mather. It was kind of a handbook on how to identify witches. One of the tests that you gave a witch was that you said, recite the Lord's Prayer. And of course, if you're a witch, you can't do that, right? They said to Goody Glover, recite the Lord's Prayer. And she did. The only problem was it was in Latin. That's a no-no. That's too Catholic. Because the Puritans didn't believe in all that Latin Roman Catholic stuff. She was also, the reason why she was arrested was she was saying a rosary. She was accused of witchcraft. And you would think, this doesn't quite fit the rule that she can't recite the Lord's Prayer, but that didn't matter to the Puritans. They hanged her as being a witch. And today there is a restaurant at the head of Hanover Street called Goody Glover's, if you want to go to it. And it has this plaque outside. And they refer to her as the first Irish martyr of Boston. And there's a little portrait outside. Now, I don't know if she looked like this or not. We don't really know. But this poor woman was just, trying to practice her religion and was accused of being a witch. And then let's go back to England. Now, this will relate to Boston. Now, in England, they have something called Guy Fawkes Day. It's like the 4th of July here. They have fireworks and they celebrate, they dance in the streets. It's kind of half Mardi Gras, half 4th of July, And this is all because of something called the Gunpowder Plot. It seems that in 1605 that a group of Catholics, not liking the way they were being treated by England, decided that they would surreptitiously get into the basement of Parliament and bring kegs of gunpowder. And when Parliament was going to meet, they were going to light the gunpowder and blow them sky high. The only thing was, they got caught. And the guy that was supposed to guard the gunpowder was named Guy Fawkes. And he was caught. He was brought to the Tower of London. And you know what they do to people in the Tower of London. So pretty soon he gave up all of his Confederates. And they arrested them all, and they were accused of treason. They were tried and convicted of treason. Now, the English have a wonderful way of dealing with traitors. They want to make a real example out of people that are traitors. And this is what they did to those people. It's something called being drawn and quartered. First, you are drawn out of prison, sometimes just by a rope dragged along the ground, or maybe if you're lucky, you get a little sled ride. And then you're brought to the gallows. You're put in a noose, hanged within an inch of your life. They cut you down, gasping for air. And then they put you on a table, cut you open, stem to stern, start pulling your insides out while you're still conscious. You probably pray for going unconscious. And then the coup d'etat, the coup de resistance, is that they actually quarter you. That means they cut off all of your limbs. If you're lucky, they just cut them off. Sometimes they would tie each limb to a separate horse and have the horses go in separate directions. And then you're beheaded, and your head is stuck on a pike. And usually it's put on London Bridge, so everybody can see it and see what is done to a traitor. This is what was done to those men. Now, Guy Fawkes, he was the last one to go up. One after another, they did this horrible butchery to them. And he got up there, ready to be hanged and disemboweled. And what he did was he just jumped off the scaffold and cracked his head open and died. So he avoided the hangman's noose. Now, how does this connect to Boston? This holiday was celebrated in Boston too. But it wasn't called Guy Fawkes Day in Boston. It was called Pope's Day. And what they would do is they'd have gangs of ruffians all over Boston, and they'd all make an effigy of the Pope. And they'd drag their effigies around in each gang and try to tear apart the other's effigy. And the gang that was left at the end of the day with their effigy still intact won. Now, after a few years, some people got killed doing this. I'm sure there was alcohol involved and whatnot. But this ended during the Revolution. After the British occupied Boston, we know that George Washington came in, put the cannons up, and they retook Boston. George Washington was the commander in Boston, and he heard about this thing. November 5th was coming up, and he made an edict. He said, this is going to stop. We are no longer going to do this anymore. He said to the people, the reason is, we've got Irish in our army that have been fighting and dying for this country, and I will not have this. And that was the end of Pope's Day. Here's some souvenirs from Pope's Day. You could get a mug with the Pope and the devil. Yeah. And of course, it's almost synonymous, Irish and Catholic. There were some French in Boston too, but for the most part, it was aimed at the Irish Catholics. Now, after a while, after hiding in the shadows, the Irish begin to emerge. They start to feel a little bit safe. You know, some of these taboos, the ideas of the anti-Catholic law is wearing off, and they start to emerge. And these are some Irish firsts in Boston. Now, if you look at this, this is the actual site where the first Mass in New England was held. Just to give you a little orientation, this is the South Church. There's a bookstore over here, and there is the Famine Memorial. I don't know if you've ever seen that statue. And there was an old barn there in 1788, and they had the first Mass in New England in Boston. And nobody got hanged or killed. So the toleration level was going up a little bit for Catholics, Irish and French Catholics here. Here's another first. It wasn't until 1803 that the Catholics could actually establish a cathedral, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. And this was on Franklin Street, and there is a plaque marking the location of the cathedral. The property is actually still owned by the Catholic Church. I think this is part of St. John's Seminary. Here's another one. This was the first Irish Catholic burial ground. It's in South Boston, St. Augustine's Chapel. And it wasn't until 1818, I believe, that the Catholics, the Irish Catholics, were actually able to be buried in consecrated ground. Now, if you grow up Catholic, you know you need to be buried in a cemetery that's consecrated. And a lot of these Catholics that originally came over here did not have that benefit. In fact, there have been archaeological finds of Catholic bones actually just buried in paupers' graves alongside some of these Puritan cemeteries. They did not have the benefit of being buried in a Catholic burial ground until 1818. And here's that cemetery, which I found, I was kind of disappointed. I went to South Boston. This is right off of Broadway. This was the first Irish Catholic burial ground. I couldn't get into it. It was locked up, which is, you know, in Boston, I understand there's a lot of burial grounds that are locked up because of vandalism and whatnot. But what I found was the condition of this place is deplorable. Look, the sign looks like it hasn't been painted in years. Trash all over the place. If you look, the lawn looked like it hadn't been mowed in I don't know how long. Barrels, just piles of wood and dirt and everywhere. So I was kind of disappointed. I hope that was just, maybe it was before spring cleanup or something, I don't know. But this was the first place that Catholics, Irish Catholics, were able to be buried. It's kind of sad. And they, by 1829, there was a newspaper that could connect the people together. Now they had a voice. They could communicate. Now, Again, when you ask most people, when did the Irish come to Boston? Oh, the potato famine. Actually, just a little bit before, in the 1820s, a little trickle of Irish began to seep in, and tensions started to mount, too. Now, the Irish came here because of these laws. By this time, England was totally in control of Ireland, controlled most of the land, and those Irish that still own land, they passed these laws to get them out. Look at this. I'm going to read some of these to you. The Irish Catholic was forbidden to exercise his religion, forbidden to receive an education, to enter a profession, to hold public office, to engage in trade or commerce, some of these other things, forbidden to vote, to purchase land, to be guardian to his child, to educate his child. Basically, they're taking away and stripping all the human rights away from the Irish Catholics. The ones that had the money to get out, got out. And then they passed these laws as well. These are the Enclosure Acts, and they basically said, if you own land, you couldn't do anything with it. Might as well sell it to an Englishman. And that was the idea. And it worked. A lot of Irish said, I'm out of here, and they sold their land, they got out, and they came to America. Now, to give you an idea of this early migration here, this is some statistics about population in Boston here. The population of Irish had grown to about 2,000 by 1820, and then 5,000 by 1825, 7,000 by 1830. So you're seeing a gradual build-up in population. To put it in context, the city of Boston had about 61,000 people. So you're starting to see a small nut of Irish people there. And tensions start to build just with that small level of Irish. And you start having incidents. That old mentality, that old Puritan mentality, now called the Boston Brahmin mentality, is still there. And that's what these people walked into. The shining city on the hill. And this is probably what the city looked like when they got there. And this is the early 1800s. Now, here are some early conflicts that happened. This is a picture of the Ursuline Convent. Now, this was in Charlestown. Today it's Somerville. Right on the place called Mount Benedict, named after, not the Pope, but the Bishop Benedict. And this convent was actually a school. And the Ursuline nuns, most of them were Irish. The funny thing was the people that went to this school were the Boston Brahmins' children. The girls of the people that lived up on Beacon Hill were sent to this school because it was a first-class education in classics. Latin, Greek, music, you name it. These girls could go there and they got a great education. Now, what happened was there were a few things that happened here. There was a woman who was one of these students. She actually went there on a scholarship. And she was from one of these Yankee families, but not the high-class Yankee family. And she spent some time there as a student. And she became what they call a novice. That's somebody that's actually starting to think about becoming a nun. But then all of a sudden she left. And she wrote a manuscript. And the manuscript said that this place was a hellhole. That the nuns were brutal. Never heard that before, right? That the nuns actually would try to brainwash these young Yankee women, that they try to inculcate them into the Catholic religion, that some of them were tortured. They had torture chambers down in the basement. And this got out into the population. The thing was, it was all baloney. It was all not true. But people started to read this, and rumors started to fly about this chamber of horrors that was going on here. Now, another thing happened was that there was one of the nuns actually left the place. She was a music teacher. It was in the middle of the summer, 1834, I think. And she just had it. And she just put down her, her book, and she walked out. And I can kind of identify that with that. I teach 8th grade, so there's some days where I feel like doing that. And she just walked out. She ended up going into town, and she stayed with a prominent Brahmin family. And what happened was the Mother Superior, her name was Sister Mary St. George, her actual name was Mary Moffat, Irish woman, came out with the bishop, and they sat down and they talked to her. They calmed her down. And then pretty soon she was embarrassed that she did it. They agreed to have her come back up to the convent and cool out and everything. So the thing was, that story got out into the public that one of the nuns actually escaped. Was she being tortured? Were horrible things being done to her? And there was nothing of the like. Pretty soon, the people were in an uproar, and they were calling for an investigation. And the selectmen actually approached the Ursuline convent, went up to the front door, and Mary Moffat came out, stuck her head out the window, and they demanded entry to investigate this convent. In her being you read about her, she was a tough nut. She basically told them to go hit the highway. So they left, and then they came back, and they demanded again. But in the meantime, I think she had talked to the bishop, and he said, let them in. So reluctantly, she let them in. They inspected the convent. They looked under the beds. They looked for the torture chambers. They pulled the students aside and said, have they been trying to make you into a Catholic? And they found out none of it was true. It was all false. It was actually a really great place. The nuns looked happy. The kids looked happy. So they returned to their homes, and they didn't tell anybody. The people were still out there jabbering about this, and the tenor got really bad. And then one night, a group of laborers that had been laboring near there, I think they had a few drinks, started to rabble-rouse and started to yell, let them out, let them out. And before you knew it, there was a crowd of 3,000 people. Now, it wasn't just the story of the escaped nun and the girl that was kidnapped, supposedly. There was also a reverend that came into town that had fired up this crowd, too. I forgot to tell you about him. His name was Reverend Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was a fire and brimstone Protestant minister, and he preached 3 blazing sermons. In one of his sermons, he actually encouraged the populace to burn down that cathedral, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. So people were fired up not only from these stories, but this man that came into town. And before you knew it, that night, that crowd of workmen grew into 3,000 people, and they were shouting to have those students released because they thought they were being held prisoner, and to let the nuns go. And Mary Moffat, being Mary Moffat, stuck her head out the window and told them where to go. The next thing you know, that door got kicked down, and the mob was in the convent. Now you can imagine the nuns and the students. This mob of 3,000 people coming in the front door, they went out the back door. But they went through that convent, and they started to rip it apart. They went through all the valuables. There's stories of pianos going out the window, books being thrown around, cloth, everything. Things being looted, and before you knew it, somebody lit a match. And they burned that convent to the ground. The next day, news got out in Boston, and even the folks up on Beacon Hill were aghast at this horrible thing that had been done. And word got out that they were going to head for the cathedral the next day. The governor got wind of it, and they called out the militia, and the militia surrounded the convent and stood in between the mob and the convent. So the mob decided to go back to, the cathedral. They were going at the cathedral, so the militia stood in front of the cathedral. So they went back to the convent, which is now in ashes, and started to raid the tombs of nuns that had died. There's stories of them opening those caskets and pulling out gold teeth. This was done. This actually happened in Boston. And there's a little marker there, actually near the Somerville Library. This is all in Somerville now. which used to be part of Charlestown. This is the neighborhood where it happened. It's the hill, Mount Benedict's been leveled a little bit, and the convent's gone, and these houses stand in that location. And as a historian, I always walk through these places, and I look in the windows, and I think, I wonder if people that live here know what happened on this ground right here. How many people know what happened here? It's still called Mount Benedict Street. Horrible story. And then there was something called the Broad Street Riot. It appears that there were a group of firemen, and they were coming back from a fire, Yankee firemen, and a group of Irish coming back from a wake. And you know what Irish do at a wake. The two groups passed. We don't know what was said. Somebody said something to someone, and a melee broke out. A giant brawl broke out. And before you knew it, all of Broad Street was engulfed in this riot. Thousands of people were going and breaking into houses and looting and tearing apart, lighting them on fire. And I think after 3 days, this riot was finally quelled. And believe it or not, nobody died. A bunch of people were arrested, Yankees and Irish, and the Irish went to jail. Now, if you look at Broad Street today, and it's the financial district, but back then this is what it looked like. And you can imagine this riot in the middle of the street. So you can tell, you can still tell those old attitudes toward the Irish are still there. And they don't even have a lot of Irish yet. Wait till the potato famine comes. And then it came. And this potato famine. Growing up, I always thought, why did the Irish starve? Because the potato went bad. There's a lot of other things you can eat. The reason why is because of this. If you look at this, you might see how they have little huts here. Let me show you another picture. The English had taken over Ireland to such an extent that they actually were renting out the land that people formerly owned. And you were lucky if you got a little patch like this and a little hut. And then your job was to go and work the big farms of the English. Now, you had to provide for yourself. And on this little patch of land, the best thing that you could plant to feed your family for their entire year was potatoes. Because it was something that you could plant in a small area, and you got a lot of food out of that. And the potato went bad, people start to starve, and we had what they call the potato famine, the Great Hunger. Now initially, the English government tried to help people. They set up soup kitchens, they set up kind of workhouses, and it mitigated it for a little while. And then you had a change of administration. You went from the liberals to the conservatives. And basically they had a kind of a laissez-faire attitude. And their attitude was, well, it's the Irish's fault. You know, it's their fault, they should suffer the consequences. So what they did was they said, the British government is no longer going to be involved in this. Now, we're going to put it on you, the landlords. They're your people, you take care of them. And the landlords did that. They started to evict people. And it just got worse and worse and worse. People were starving to death. They couldn't work. They couldn't pay the rent. And they ended up getting evicted out into the streets, out into the countryside to scavenge for whatever food they could find. And these are actual lithographs that I took from British newspapers. These are from newspapers that the British were sitting in their homes reading about the Irish famine just a few hundred miles away. And the mobs went to the cities, and pretty soon they realized there was no food in the cities. And it just got worse and worse and worse. It wasn't only 1 year. It went for a couple years. More than a couple. And people began to die in droves. Here are some lithographs of these people. And the pictures really tell the stories. These were drawn from life. It's like if you took a photograph of these people. Skeletons, human skeletons. First, you'd eat all the food you could get from scavenging, and enough people are out there starving to death. All that's gone. Pretty soon you start eating your shoe leather, your belt. There's stories of people coming down the road and finding just dead bodies on the side of the road. And when they'd kick them over, they'd notice that their mouths were all green. And that was because they were trying to eat the grass. And you can't survive on grass. And this was becoming a real crisis. And you know, I have to say something. The folks in Boston, these Boston Brahmins that I've been talking about, actually organized a relief ship called the Jamestown that they sent to Ireland with food and help for these folks. And it just started getting so bad that they had to think of some solution. And the solution was to send these people to America, to send them out of Ireland. And that's what they did. And this is actually a statue, not in the United States, but this is in Dublin. This shows the condition of the folks when they left. They were already sick, they were already dying, and they were just put aboard these ships. Here's a picture of people sending some of these people off. Thousands came to America, and they came aboard these ships. They were called coffin ships. Here's a good one. Imagine spending 2 months in that. You've already got people that are sick. There's disease, typhus, tuberculosis going through here. And a lot of people died along the way. And when I saw this picture, something flashed in my head. It was like, I've seen that before. But I remember this because I used to teach the Middle Passage. And that's when the slaves were brought from Africa to America, and they did the tight pack and the loose pack. And this looks like a scene from one of those movies that you've seen bringing the Africans over. But these are Irish. And the conditions were not really much better. Many of them, as I said, died along the way. They never even got here. But when they got here, I'm sure their hearts were uplifted. And they knew that, some of them knew that they had relatives here. And when they got here, they were welcomed with open arms from their relatives. Now, just to give you an idea of the onslaught, I think it was 1847. Just in Boston alone, 38,000 Irish came to Boston. That's a flood. And you can imagine when there's already a bunch of people here, other jobs, other places to live, it was very difficult. And this is the kind of slums that they lived in. New York City was probably the worst, the 5 Points down in New York City, but we had comparable slums here. And this is how they arrived. This is in Boston. This is the Famine Memorial. I love the statue because it's not just this. There's another part of the statue, or statuary. This is the modern Irish family. And you can see how they're juxtaposed. So the modern Irish family is here, and they're looking back where their ancestors came from. This is where we came from. We were the survivors. And this is what they came to. The housing was crowded. The neighborhoods that they came into, now, when you think of Boston, you think, oh, Southie, that's where all the Irish live. Actually, the original place that the Irish moved to was the North End. The North End, you know, you go there for spaghetti, right? Linguine. The North End was an Irish ghetto before it was an Italian ghetto. And there were some Jews in there too. But it was an Irish ghetto. The waterfront, the Battery March area, all these areas, the South End, before South Boston was ever populated by the Irish. And this is the city they came to. This was actually the first photograph taken, an aerial photograph taken in Boston from a hot air balloon in the 1850s. And what they came to was pretty deplorable. They settled their families into these places. They were just put wherever they could put them, into sheds, into low-ceiling garrets, into cellars. The unsanitary conditions were unimaginable. And these people just kept coming and coming and coming and crowding. But you know what? It was better than starving. Now, let me read to you a little bit here. One survey showed, this is, I think, in the North End. Sorry. One survey showed that 67 toilets were in 118 houses inhabited by 540 immigrants. 17 of those were out of order. One sink might serve a whole stinking tenement. One outhouse might serve a whole neighborhood. This is what they moved into. Horrible, horrible conditions. And when they got there, there were tenements, and these are the alleys, these are the alleyways that the Irish lived in. Now, this is from the North End. And when you go to the North End today, this is prime property. This is a lot of money. But it was in these same buildings that these immigrants came. You can imagine this back in those days. In fact, here's a picture to give you an idea of what that alley probably looked like at one time. Doing their wash in the alleyways here. These same streets. Crowded families in one apartment. And it's funny, when you go around the North End, a lot of these buildings have Irish names on them. And that's probably what Hanover Street looked like at one time. Now, when they got here, of course, these people are farmers. There weren't any farms in Boston. They had to find ways of making their living. And this is the work that they were offered. If you got here as an immigrant, and if you were lucky, you might get a job, especially women, you might get a job as a washerwoman. That meant you spent hours on your knees scrubbing the floors, especially up in Beacon Hill. You might get a job working for the city on your knees scrubbing floors. And other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of other opportunities. You might be a domestic in one of the houses where you do some cooking and housekeeping, but this was pretty much what you were offered for jobs. And many of the Irish became domestics and washerwomen. The men had a few more opportunities. They could be waiters, if you're lucky. If you were a barber in Ireland and came over here, you're out of luck, because the market was already cornered by the blacks. They were the barbers in Boston back then. You could work in a grocery store. This is an old grocery. Again, if you're lucky. And of course, the sweatshops. The ones that didn't have the signs on the outside that said no Irish need apply, you could work there for the privilege of working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. Grueling work in the heat of the summer. You can imagine that place, the cold of the winter. And you couldn't even have a break to eat your lunch. You had to eat by your machine because they got paid by piecework, which meant that the more you produced, the more money you made. And that's how it went in the factories, and they were all over the place. Some of our parents, some of our grandparents probably worked there. This is what Boston looked like then. The EPA hadn't come about yet. And a lot of Irishmen were drawn to the waterfront. They became stevedores, they became longshoremen. They made their living loading and offloading these ships by hand, not with cranes. And this is what the waterfront looked like back then. This is what it looks like now. Not as teeming with ships as it used to be. And there were people that also made their living clamming and lobstering and fishing and doing all these things down on the waterfront. These are some folks that actually made their living digging clams. And of course, the quintessential ditch digger, the blacklegs, the muckraker, that's what they called them. And the work was backbreaking. Many of these men didn't make it past 50. Mayor Curley, who you're going to hear about later, his father was one of these guys, and he was thought of as a big, brawny guy, and he went to pick up a big rock one day, and he had a brain aneurysm and dropped dead right on the job. No easy work for these guys. But they did it. And you know why? It was better than starving. And Boston provided plenty of jobs eventually, because there was a whole new movement to enlarge Boston. And it started with taking Beacon Hill down. Now, Beacon Hill was actually removed. The monument that you see now is in back of the State House. And it was done by Irish. They did this, they took the hill down because they wanted to fill in all the marshy areas of the city and expand it. This is what Boston looked like when the Puritans got there. And this is what the Irish did. With Irish labor, these areas were filled in. Now, it's kind of funny, if you go down to Chinatown, there's a little, off of Nealon Street, there's a street called Beach Street. It's nowhere near the beach. It used to be. This was all done with Irish labor. And this is the city that you know today. All that was filled in. Eventually, they used up all the hills in Boston. They started going out to Needham and the outlying places and bringing dirt in from there. And there were trains running 24/7, bringing dirt in to fill in all those areas. All with Irish help. Now, after this flood of Irish immigrants, of course, there was going to be a backlash. And the nativists, really, they were angered because of the flood of these people coming in. They couldn't handle the population coming in, and there was a backlash, and this took the form of a political party. This political party was called the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. Now, they were called the Know Nothing Party because they started off as a secret society, and they didn't keep any notes. They didn't keep any minutes of their meetings, which is bad for historians because we don't know what they did too much. But when somebody would come up and ask them what they were up to, they would say, "I know nothing," kind of like Sergeant Schultz. But they knew enough to run for office, and they were able to get elected in Massachusetts. Let me tell you about some of the things here. In the election of 1854, this probably hasn't happened since. This one party, this nativist Know Nothing Party, swept the elections in 1854. Mainly due to this influx of Irish. They swept every state constitutional office, including the governor. They won all 40 state Senate races, carried every U.S. congressional district. Out of 381 seats up for election in the State House of Reps, they won 379. Henry H. Gardner, the Know Nothing candidate for the governor, carried every city in the Commonwealth in all but 20 of the 300 some odd towns. So they swept into office, and they started to implement their program. The governor, he said as soon as he got here, he said, the problem is the Irish, and we need to reverse this and send them back. And that's what they started to do. They formed all these committees. One of the committees they formed was the Inspection of Convents Committee. Now, this committee, as depicted here in the newspaper, would actually go into these convents and inspect them You see here, they're looking for some kind of horrible things that the nuns are doing here, but this is all they found. Anybody know what that is? Yeah. Chamber pot, yeah. They used to call them the thunder jug. This is kind of comical, but they did things like this. They forbade the reading of the King James Bible. Forbade anything but the reading of the King James Bible in public schools, banned the teaching of foreign languages, disbanded all the Irish militia units. They also proposed a constitutional amendment that Roman Catholics could not hold any office in Massachusetts. Kind of reminiscent of England a little bit. That never passed, though, luckily. Also, under the Pauper Removal Act, they sent 1,300 Irish paupers who were newly arrived back to England. And I think this kind of illustrates that. That was their mindset. All these people are coming over. It's a strain on us. We need to start to send them back. So this anti-foreigner attitude got them elected. Now, the funny thing is, the Know Nothing Party only lasted for a few years. And they broke up after a few years. And the funny thing was, part of this Know Nothing Party, part of their platform was abolition of slavery. Isn't that funny? They wanted to send all these people back, but they wanted to abolish slavery. Now, when they broke up, the abolitionist part of the Know Nothings eventually became known as the Republican Party, the party of Abe Lincoln. And these are some cartoons that I found from the newspapers at the time. This was the attitude of Americans towards these newly arrived Irish immigrants. Now, at first glance, it's kind of hard to figure out what this means here. You have to look at it for a couple minutes. Here are the innocent Native Americans. That's what they call themselves, the natives. And these evil bishops, those are bishops with their mitre hats, arriving on the shore, attacking them. The Irish and their Catholic priests are coming in, they're invading. This was done by Thomas Nast, believe it or not. Here's another one. Now, this is a depiction of a typical Irishman. This is actually a good one. Shows him. The features are a little distorted, but it's not too bad. This is how they would typically be depicted, though. This one here. As an ape-like, drunken creature. Just laying around, not doing anything, not working, good for nothing. A brawler. This was, some of the stereotypes still exist. Drunken brawler, fighting Irish. And of course, here's one depicting that drunken, ape-faced Irishman getting involved in politics. Oh, how dare he? Because he's going to bring the Catholic Church in. You know that the Irish are controlled by the Catholic Church. Can't elect an Irishman because the Catholic Church controls him. Geez, I think I remember hearing that. There was a guy named John F. Kennedy that had to deal with that stuff. Yeah, I think that's the last time they did that. And here's a one I thought. There was another group that wasn't too well liked either during these times, the Chinese. And can you imagine these cartoons in the papers today? No way. This is way before political correctness. But that's how people thought. That's how they thought about the Irish and the Chinese, as you see. I like this one. Who would you want for your nurse? Florence Nightingale or Bridget McBruiser? This is how the Irish were depicted. And of course, we have the paddy wagon. That's why it's called the paddy wagon, because Paddy got thrown in there after getting drunk or something and hauled off to the hoosegow. Now the Irish had had enough, and they started to organize. And these are some of the forerunners of the Irish power politics in Boston. It started with this guy, Paddy Maguire. He got a college education, and he formed something called the Young Men's Democratic Club. And people would come to the club, they'd talk politics, they started organizing. And pretty soon, the people in the neighborhood learned that they could go there if they needed anything. It was kind of this mutual aid society political club. Now they organized, they started getting Irish people elected to minimal, offices like lamplighter, maybe street sweeper. But then they started getting people in on the city council, aldermen, and before you knew it, they had the first Irish mayor of Boston, and that was Hugh O'Brien. He got elected in 1885. But he had to do this with the help of some of the more liberal Brahmins. It was what I call the age of cooperation. They looked at O'Brien and they said, well, he's a clean Irishman. He dresses fine. We can work with him. And he was actually a very good administrator. And he got in with the help of some of the Boston Brahmins. And then the second guy that was elected as mayor of Boston that was Irish was Patrick Collins. Now, during this time, we start to see the emergence of what they call ward politics. Let me show you the master of them all. This is Martin LeMantsney. And he was the ward boss in the West End of Boston. And here's his clubhouse. They all had a clubhouse. His clubhouse was called the Hendricks Club. And he ran for office a few times, was a state rep, different things, but he controlled the West End. Because people knew if they went to LeMantsney, if you needed a job, he could get you a job. If you needed food, he could find you something to eat. If you needed a house, he could find you a house. There was no welfare back then. And people knew that they could depend on him and the organization that he had. And it wasn't free. It did cost something. Do you know what it cost? It cost your vote. And when somebody ran for office, they needed that guy. Because he'd say, vote for so-and-so, and the whole entire West End would vote for that person. He had a lot of power. They called him the Mahatma, meaning that he had the power. Now, he had some proteges. Let me introduce you to some of his proteges here. This is a young guy by the name of Johnny Fitz. Later, this was mangled into Honey Fitz. Yeah, Honey Fitzgerald, John Fitzgerald from the North End. He was a young up-and-comer. His father died at a young age. He had to take over the family, and he did that, and he started getting involved in ward politics. And across the river in East Boston was this guy. This is P.J. Kennedy. Fitzgerald Kennedy. And a few years later, a younger guy came up, and his name was James Michael Curley. And they all learned at the foot of this LeMantsney. They learned how to get votes, how to start a machine. And let me tell you about some of these guys individually. Honey Fitz, as I said, was from the North End. This is where he lived in the North End. It's right off of North Square. It's called Garden Court. And I think I got some more pictures here. This is a plaque that's outside, and probably people walk by it every day and don't even look at it. It says, this is the house where Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy was born. Now, when you think of the Kennedys, you think of Hyannis, you think of Palm Beach. This is where they lived. The Fitzgeralds, at least. The Kennedys also lived in a tenement over in East Boston. This is where it all started. As I said, as a young man, he lost his father. He had to take control of the family. And he was just a ball of energy. He was all over the place. And he started working for the local boss in the North End. And then the boss died. And he just stepped right in it and became the ward boss of the North End. Formed his own club called the Jefferson Club. And because he worked with LeMantsney, he knew exactly what to do. And he was a master at glad handling people. He'd be walking around the North End, and he'd spot people, and he'd go, my dearos, my dearos. He called everybody from the North End his dearo. And he just had this magnetic personality. Now, this is the door to that tenement. It looks like it hasn't been painted since he lived there. It's privately owned. I'd love to get in there. Across the river was this guy, P.J. Kennedy, and he started off as a saloon owner. And he noticed that people came to the saloon, they talked politics, And he started to help people out, a lot like Martin Lemansky. They came to P.J. Kennedy and he helped them out, started getting into politics, helped people get elected. He got elected a few times himself. Built more saloons. Before you knew it, he had all sorts of saloons all over Boston. And probably had control of a lot of the liquor that came into Boston too. Here's a picture of him along with the Fitzgerald clan at Old Orchard Beach. There might be some people you recognize here. This is Rose, and where is he? There he is. There's Joe Sr., soon to be the Kennedy clan. And here he is with his grandson a few years later. I don't know if you know this face. Yeah. And then the other guy, James Michael Curley. He was born in the South End, not South Boston, the South End, which is right on the border of Roxbury. And he was born not too far from City Hospital here, right across the street actually, at Northampton Street. Now I tracked down the address and I found it was 28 Northampton Street. And I got there and I found 28 doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be attached to this building. And you can imagine that the building that was there once probably looked a lot like this. And you can imagine James Michael Curley sitting up in one of those windows. A lot of times you read different things about Curley, and in his early years you read accounts from his friends, and actually he was very quiet as a young man. He had to drop out of school, and his friends would actually see him up in the window just reading to himself. Now he had to drop out of school because his father died, another one whose father died, and I told you about that earlier, and he had to take on the role of the man of the house. He had his mother and his brother to support. His mother was a washerwoman, down on her knees scrubbing those floors. And he had to take control of the family. He worked for a druggist. He had various jobs. And then one day somebody said, "Why don't you get into politics? You really can talk pretty well." And he said, "Yeah, why don't I try that?" And he decided to run, and he eventually ended up as a city councilman. He formed his own political group, and it was called, his clubhouse of all things was called the Tammany Club. I don't know why he named it that. If you're familiar with the Tammany Club in New York City, you probably wouldn't want it that. This is the building that he had the Tammany Club in. This is around in the early 1930s. This is the location today. I don't believe the building is actually there anymore, but that's there. You can see where that corner is. Now, he was into politics, and he was a master at helping people whenever they wanted to get something. He was so good at it, he ended up in jail. What happened was, one of his constituents, an Irishman, came to James Michael Curley. He had just taken the postal exam and flunked it. And he came to Curley and said, "Oh, James Michael! Oh, I didn't pass the bloody postal exam because I couldn't spell the word Constantinople." And Curley said, "I'll take care of it." This is how he took care of it. Next time they had the postal exam, he went in there and passed himself off as this guy and took the test and passed it. But then he got caught. He got caught and he went to jail for it. And you know, this would dog him for the rest of his life. He would be mayor 5 times, governor 1 time. I think he was also in Congress once too. It would dog him. Every election they'd go, "What about the time you were in jail?" And he had the same answer every time. He would say, "I did it for a friend." And that did it for the people that lived in that district, knew he was one of them. He stuck his neck out for them, and they voted him in time after time after time. He really knew how to spin it. Now, this is Mayor Collins, second mayor of Boston. He died mid-term. They needed a new mayor. Now, Martin Lemansky, he had a guy all lined up to go in there and become mayor. The only thing was, little Johnny Fitz, now known as Honey Fitz, decided to run, and Lemansky didn't like it. So he ran against Lemansky. Lemansky didn't want him to run. He ran, and he got elected anyway. So John Fitzgerald became the 3rd Irish mayor of Boston, right out of the Hendricks Club, which was in the North End. And he ran on this platform of making Boston bigger, better, and busier. And he did that. And you can see this is where his club, his headquarters was. He came to the new City Hall. This was the City Hall at the time. Now, as I said, he wanted to make Boston bigger, better, and busier. And he did that. He brought a lot of business in. He expanded Boston. And from this office in here, I think this is one of his campaign posters. Bigger, better, busier. But he also owed a lot of favors to people. He was still in ward boss mode. And people were lined up outside of his door every morning, looking for favors, looking for this, looking for that. And he did all those favors. And pretty soon, the opposition started screaming that he was giving out jobs to his friends and taking bribes and all this. And he was not elected for a second term. Poor Johnny Fitz. But he loved being mayor. You can see it here. He was just a ball of energy. Here he is at Fenway Park throwing out the first pitch. He was the first mayor in Boston to fly in a plane. He went to an air show in Squantum, and the guy who was supposed to get in the plane and fly around, this visiting dignitary, opted out at the last second. He said, "I'll do it." And he just jumped in the plane and flew off. It was one of those old biplanes. Now, by the end of his life, this is how he appeared. He was the old Fitzgerald Kennedy, the advisor to Jack Kennedy, and he would spend his days down in Palm Beach, Florida. And you know, I came across this great story. This was told by Ted Kennedy. He said that old Honeyfitz would sit in the lobbies of some of these hotels down in Palm Beach with an ear out. And every time somebody would check in at the desk, he'd listen. And if he heard the word Boston, he'd jump out of his chair and say, "My dearos!" And they would instantly recognize him. This was Honeyfitz. He'd probably get a day on the town, lunch and everything. That was Honeyfitz. The politician to the end. And I think this picture really personifies that. And I think that energy, I think Jack Kennedy got that. That sense of humor that you saw in Jack Kennedy, I think, came from this guy. And here's where he is laid to rest in Rosendale. Now there's another memorial to him too. Well, it doesn't really exist anymore. Many of you may have seen it. How many people remember driving over this thing? The John Fitzgerald Highway. I remember more sitting in traffic on it. Not This is what was there before this. Now known as the Rose Kennedy Parkway, which is above the tunnel, or as they call it, the world's most expensive car wash. Now, this brings us to the mayoral election of 1913. We're almost through here. It pitted James Michael Curley against Honeyfitz. He wanted to be mayor again, and Curley wanted to run too. Now, in the initial balloting, the initial polls that people were doing, to see who was, the newspapers, Honeyfitz was way ahead. And Curley was thinking, "Oh my God, I'm not going to get elected." Now, some good luck came to Curley, kind of. This is a horrible story. One of his men happened to find out that after every day of campaigning, Honeyfitz would go to the same place, which was this roadhouse outside of Boston. And although he was a teetotaler, he wouldn't drink at all, he did enjoy dancing with this one girl, this cigarette girl named Toodles. And Curley's men found out that Honeyfitz had been dancing with Toodles. And you know what? He even kissed her on the cheek. Well, Curley, and this gives you an idea of Curley. What Curley did was he sent a letter to Honeyfitz's wife, telling her about Toodles. And you can imagine, Honeyfitz comes back from his night with Toodles, like every day, the cigarette girl, And there's his wife with the letter, with little Rose standing there. No, what's it like, Lucy and Desi? You know, you got some laying in the dough. And the man could probably, you know, talk the ear off a horse. And he explained it. He said there was nothing wrong, and, you know, I'm not going to drop out. There was totally nothing proprietous about it, and there probably wasn't. He just enjoyed a dance and a kiss once in a while. I don't know. No evidence that anything else happened. So Curly, in the meantime, is waiting, thinking that Honeyfitz is going to drop out any time now, and it doesn't happen. So he takes it up another notch. And Curly announces that he's going to go on a lecture tour, and he puts an ad in the paper. And his first lecture is Great Lovers, from Cleopatra to Toodles. The second lecture was Great Libertines in History, Henry VIII to present. So I think Honeyfitz saw the writing on the wall that this is going to become public, his name's going to be besmirched, and all of a sudden he dropped out of the race and said he wanted to spend more time with his family, as they always do. And by default, James Michael Curley became the 4th mayor of Boston. And if you look at this picture, this really personifies Curly. I know, he was like half gangster, half, helper of the indigent, the poor. Now, when you study Curly, we could spend all night talking about Curly. And when I initially did this lecture, I thought, how can I tell people about Curly? There's so much there. So I decided to encapsulate it as this. There's the good Curly, and then there's the bad Curly. So I call this the good, the bad of the Curly. Now, the good Curly, there's many stories about good things. When he became mayor, the first thing he did, and you might think this isn't really anything special, the first thing he did upon coming into the mayoral office was to order that all the washerwomen in that building be given mops. You might think, what does that mean? He said, no woman should be on her knees unless she's praying to God. What he did was he gave those women dignity. It's funny, I just gave a lecture and a woman came up to me and she said, my mother was one of those washerwomen. Another story comes down to us about Curly, that late at night he would leave, he would work all day and night. He did the same thing as Honeyfitz, he was doing favors for everybody. And he'd come out at 10 o'clock at night, and the only person there would be his chauffeur. There weren't any cameras, there weren't any reporters or anything. And there would always be this indigent man, his name was Mike, I think. He was more than an indigent, he liked to drink a lot. That's why he was indigent. And Curly would see him, and oftentimes he'd walk up and give him that handshake with the money in the hand, and he'd say, Mike, I think I owe you this. Nobody knew this, nobody knew it until after he died. His chauffeur told this story. People would come to him, they'd need jobs, they'd need houses. He was always Johnny on the spot. You know what he did for that guy? The postal worker. And he went all the way for people. He did a lot of municipal projects. Before we get to this, he did a lot of municipal projects, bathhouses in South Boston, several wings on City Hospital he had built, all these things he had done with not his own money, but the city money. But this is the good Curly. Now, this is what personifies the bad Curly. This is his house over on the Jamaica Way. And he bought this his first term as mayor. As I said, he served 4 terms as mayor. And for somebody, even a mayor, I think he made $10,000 a year, which was pretty much back then. He could no way afford this thing. People asked him, they said, how can you afford this? And he said, well, I'm part business owner of this other business. It's a plumbing business with all people, this guy named Daley. And this is where all this extra money is coming from. No, that's not right. The money was coming from graft. It was coming from bribes. It said at one point he had 2 safes full of cash. And this is how it would work. This is a story I came across. This one workman came to Curly and said, James Michael, I'm a roofer. I need a job. Can you help me out? He went through his books. He said, okay, well, there's a school over in Jamaica Plain that needs a roof. Okay, what I want you to do, it costs X amount of dollars. I want you to put in a bid for $5,000 more. It will get accepted. You know where that $5,000 went? Yeah. So the roofer said, he was okay with that. He went up to the roof, went to the school, climbed up his ladder. The roof was perfect. There was nothing wrong with it. So he came back to Curly. He said, it doesn't need to be replaced. He said, well, just go up there and make like you're doing something and come back down and we'll pay you. That was the bad Curly. He also had a temper too. This started getting to the news that he was doing these kind of shenanigans. And at one point there was an editor that was constantly hounding him, putting stories in the newspaper. And this editor came across James Michael Curly on the street one day. You can imagine it, walking down Washington Street. And here's Curly, here's the editor. And Curly just walked right up to the man and pow, hit him right in the jaw. He went down on the ground. And the next thing he remembers is Curly standing over him, hurling invectives at him. Now, can you imagine Mayor Menino doing something like this? This was Curly. And the thing was, he got away with it. And he did the same thing to another politician who was bad-mouthing him on the radio one night. Didn't know that Curly was coming in as the next guest. And Curly actually pummeled him in the radio booth. He got away with this stuff. That was the bad Curly. He also ended up in federal prison. I won't get into that. That's a long story. But he was actually mayor, and he was in federal prison at the same time. That's the story of Curly. Now, his fourth term as mayor, he was in prison. He left office. It seems like he'd get elected every 10 years. Like they'd elect him, get sick of him, and then they'd forget about him and elect him again and get sick of him. So about every 10 years he'd get elected, all the way up through the 40s. And here he is, I think his last term as mayor. And then he ran for a fifth term. And I think I have this picture here. Yeah, that's in the 40s. Here he is running for the fifth term. He didn't get elected. So at this point, he's getting up there in years. He's had some really hard knocks. His wife's died. A couple of his children died. 2 of his children died on the same day. Believe it or not. He believed he was cursed. And he started experiencing some hard times. He lost all of his money in the scam. That's why he ended up in federal prison. And he was looking for work. And he became kind of a sad figure. He'd hang around the State House, bothering other politicians for work. Even Tip O'Neill, when he was a congressman, said that Curly came up to him and asked him if he had any work. And he knew Curly, he knew he was in a bad situation. And he said, okay, James Michael, can you do some fundraising for me? And Curly said, okay, I'll do that. And then some of the donors started to come into Tip O'Neill and saying, I thought I gave you $15,000. Would the rest of it go? And Curly was still up to his old deeds. So it was looking really bleak for him at the end, and then something happened. This came out. This was a book that was written by Edwin O'Connor, and it was about a corrupt mayor. And it was about Curly. Even though the mayor in the book was called Skeffington, it was 100% Curly. And this guy, Edwin O'Connor, actually thought if he ran into Curly, he might get the Curly treatment. But it was the exact opposite. Curly loved the book. And when O'Connor was getting out of his cab one day, and there's Curly standing right there, he thought he was going to get punched. And Curly went up and shook his hand and said, I love your book, I love your, especially the part where I die. And then they turned this book into a movie. And it was called The Last Hurrah, starring another Irishman, Spencer Tracy. Now Curly was on top of the world again. He started lecturing, calling himself Mayor Skeffington. And this is how he went out. He went out with a bang. And then he passed away. And here, I think it was in the 50s, 52 or 54, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Let's see, let's look at the grave. All right, 58. And you know, he was called a lot of things, had a lot of titles, but the one thing that he was called that I think he appreciated the most was that he was the mayor of the poor. He truly wanted to help people. And whether it was by hook or crook, he did help people. And this is how he was memorialized. When he died, he actually laid in state in the State House, in the rotunda. I don't think this has been done for anybody else since then. Even Kevin White, who just passed a few years ago, didn't get this honor. And of course, if you're in the North End, you might stop by and say hi to James Michael Curley. I take my kids on field trips here every year, and they sit on his lap and they rub his tummy, and I go, do you know who that guy is? No. And I say, that's James Michael Curley. Now, just like to end by saying, these people, the Irish, came to our shores as servants, as prisoners, as half-dead, starving refugees. They endured ethnic and religious persecution and bigotry. They endured squalor and wretched poverty. They endured back-breaking menial labor. But in the end, they overcame, they surmounted, and they prevailed. Thank you for coming out tonight.